There's a section of Arizona forest where people don't just get lost, they get erased. The Mogollon Rim stretches 200 miles of ponderosa pine and limestone cliffs, and somewhere in that wilderness, the rules stop making sense. Hikers find buildings that vanish by morning. Hunters watch themselves on trail cameras they've never approached. Drivers wake up 40 miles past where they intended to go with no memory of the journey. Welcome to Verified Souls. What you're about to hear comes from ranger reports, dash cam footage, and the kind of testimonies that end careers because no one wants to admit what they experienced up there. These aren't campfire tales. These are the encounters that made grown adults refuse to ever return to those woods. 10 accounts, 10 different types of terror. And by the end, you'll understand why the Mogollon Rim has one of the highest rates of unexplained disappearances in the American Southwest. If you've ever felt like you were being watched in the forest, if you've ever heard something that shouldn't know your name, then you need to subscribe to Verified Souls right now, because the stories we uncover don't just haunt the people who live them. They find their way into your own late-night thoughts. And some of you will recognize pieces of your own experiences in what's coming next. I've been a wildlife photographer for 11 years, and I've spent more nights alone in the forest than I have in my own bed. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I know the difference between exhaustion and reality. I know what tricks the mind can play when you're alone in the dark, when shadows move and sounds echo off ancient pines. I know all of that, and I'm telling you right now, what happened to me on Forest Road 300 wasn't fatigue, wasn't dehydration, wasn't some hallucination brought on by altitude or isolation. It was something else entirely, and 3 weeks later, I still can't explain it without my hands shaking. I'd driven up to the Mogollon Rim in early October, chasing the tail end of elk rutting season. The area along Forest Road 300 is remote, barely maintained, the kind of place where you can go days without seeing another soul. Perfect for what I needed. I had my gear, my tent, enough supplies for a week, and a very specific location in mind. A meadow clearing I'd scouted on satellite imagery where I thought I could catch bulls at dawn. The drive-in was rough, all washboard and potholes. My truck rattling over rocks as ponderosa pines crowded in from both sides. The afternoon light was already going golden, filtering through the canopy in those long autumn shafts that photographers live for. I almost missed the ranger station. It sat about 50 yards off the road, tucked back in a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any map. It was old. That much was immediately obvious. The wood siding had gone gray with age, paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the boards like dead skin. The windows were dark, covered from the inside with what looked like old newspaper or cardboard. A rusted metal sign hung crooked above the door, but I couldn't make out what it said from the road. Something about it felt frozen in time, like a photograph from the 1970s that had somehow survived into the present day. I pulled over. I shouldn't have. I had maybe an hour of good light left, and I wanted to set up camp before dark. But something about that building pulled at me. Professional curiosity, maybe. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, to the stories they hold in their rotting beams and broken glass. I grabbed my camera, force of habit, and walked through the tall grass toward the structure. The forest was quiet around me. Not silent, but quiet in that particular way, where you notice the absence of birdsong, where every step you take sounds too loud. The closer I got, the more details emerged. The ranger station was smaller than I'd first thought, maybe 20 by 20 feet, single story with a peaked roof that sagged in the middle. The porch had partially collapsed on one side, boards jutting out at odd angles. But what struck me most was how intact it seemed otherwise. No graffiti, no broken windows, no signs of the usual vandalism you find in abandoned structures this accessible. It was like someone had just locked up one day decades ago and never came back. I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked, but held my weight. I remember that sound so clearly, the specific groan of old wood, the way dust puffed up from between the cracks. I remember reaching out and touching the doorframe, running my fingers along the peeling paint, feeling the rough texture of exposed wood underneath. The door was locked, or maybe just swollen shut. I didn't try very hard to open it. Instead, I moved to the window, cut my hands against the glass to peer inside. It was too dark to see much. Shapes that might have been furniture, might have been shadows. A suggestion of a desk, maybe a filing cabinet against the far wall. The air that leaked out around the window frame smelled like old paper and mouse droppings and decades of abandonment. I took a few photos of the exterior, making a mental note to ask around about the place later. Abandoned ranger stations aren't uncommon in national forest land. Budgets get cut, and remote outposts get shuttered. But this one had a strange feel to it, like it had been forgotten rather than abandoned. The light was fading fast. I walked back to my truck and continued up the road another quarter-mile to where the meadow opened up. I set up my tent in the usual routine, started a small fire, ate a cold dinner while the stars came out. The whole time, I kept thinking about that building, wondering about its history, about the rangers who'd staffed it, about why it had been left to rot instead of being demolished or repurposed. I fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the pines and the distant bugling of elk somewhere out in the darkness. Dawn woke me the way it always does in the forest. Gradually, the light seeping through the tent fabric from black to gray to pale gold. I had maybe 20 minutes before the sun cleared the ridge, perfect timing to get into position. I grabbed my camera gear and headed back down the road on foot, moving quickly, my breath misting in the cold morning air. The plan was to cut through the clearing where the ranger station sat, take the direct route to my shooting location, rather than following the road's curve. I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you. I was fully awake. I'd had coffee. The sun was coming up. This wasn't some middle-of-the-night confusion, some half-asleep stumbling in the dark. I walked into that clearing in broad daylight, and the ranger station was gone. Not collapsed, not burned down. Gone. Where the building had stood less than 12 hours earlier, there was just forest. Mature ponderosa pines, their trunks thick and scarred with age. Understory vegetation, fallen logs covered in moss. Virgin forest that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in 100 years. I stood there, staring at the space, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. I walked to where the porch had been, where I'd stood and felt those boards creak under my feet. Nothing. No foundation stones, no nails, no fragments of wood or metal or glass, no depression in the soil where a structure had stood, no fire ring, no trash, nothing. I pulled out my camera, my hands shaking now, and scrolled back through yesterday's photos. I had 6 shots of that ranger station. Exterior shots showing the gray siding, the collapsed porch, the rusted sign above the door. I zoomed in, studying every pixel. And here's the part that broke something in my mind. In every single photo, where the building should have been, there were just trees. The same trees I was looking at right now. The composition was identical. The angle was identical. The lighting was identical. But instead of a derelict ranger station, the images showed undisturbed forest. I checked the metadata. The photos had been taken at exactly the time I remembered taking them. 5:47 p.m. the previous evening, the GPS coordinates matched my location. But the content was wrong. Or my memory was wrong. Or something was fundamentally wrong with reality in this particular patch of forest. I spent 2 hours searching that clearing. I walked grid patterns. I examined every inch of ground. I looked for any evidence that a structure had ever existed there. Nothing. The forest was pristine, untouched, ancient. Trees that size take 70, 80, 100 years to grow. They couldn't have sprouted overnight. But I know what I saw. I know what I touched. I can still feel that peeling paint under my fingertips. Still hear those boards creaking. Still smell that ancient paper and dust smell leaking from around the window frame. I didn't get my elk photos that morning. I packed up my camp and drove straight back to Payson, breaking every speed limit on those dirt roads. I've tried to research that location since, tried to find records of ranger stations along Forest Road 300, tried to match my photos with historical archives. Nothing. No building ever existed there, according to every map and document I can find. But I was there. I touched it. I remember. And here's what keeps me awake at night. What makes me question everything I think I know about the world. If the forest can erase a building that completely, that thoroughly, what else has it erased? What else have I seen that doesn't exist? What else might vanish when I'm not looking? I haven't been back to the Mogollon Rim since that morning. I don't think I ever will, because some part of me knows that if I went back and found that ranger station standing there again, solid and real and rotting in its clearing, that would be even worse than finding nothing at all. I need to tell you something about silence. Real silence. The kind you only find when you're truly alone in the wilderness. Most people think they've experienced it, but they haven't. There's always something. A car in the distance. A neighbor's air conditioner. The hum of power lines. But out on the Mogollon Rim, miles from the nearest road, you can find silence so complete, it becomes a physical presence. It presses against your eardrums. It makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small, wet sounds your mouth makes when you swallow. I used to love that silence. I used to hike solo specifically to find it, to wrap myself in it like a blanket. That was before I learned that silence isn't empty. Before I learned that sometimes something else is listening in that quiet, waiting for you to make the first sound. I'd been on the trail for 3 days when it started. This was last September, a solo backpacking trip along one of the more remote stretches near the rim's edge. I'm not going to tell you exactly where. I have my reasons for that, and you'll understand why by the end of this. The trail itself was barely maintained, more of a game path than anything designated for human use. I had my GPS, my sat phone for emergencies, all the usual precautions. I'm experienced. I've been doing this for years. I mention that because I need you to know I wasn't some unprepared amateur who panicked at the first strange occurrence. What happened to me wasn't inexperience or poor judgment. It was something else entirely. The third day dawned cold and clear, that perfect autumn weather where the air tastes like pine resin and distant snow. I'd camped on a small plateau, maybe 50 yards from where the land just drops away into nothing. Those sheer limestone cliffs the rim is famous for. My plan was to spend the morning at the edge, watching the sunrise paint the valley below, maybe journaling, maybe just sitting with my thoughts. I made coffee on my camp stove, packed some trail mix and an apple, and walked to the overlook in the early light. The view was stunning. 2,000 feet straight down to the valley floor, the world spreading out below me in layers of blue-green forest and red rock. The sun came up slowly, bleeding gold across the horizon. I sat on a flat boulder at the edge and just breathed it in, letting the silence settle around me. That perfect, complete silence I'd come here to find. I didn't talk to myself. I never do when I'm solo hiking. Part of the appeal is not having to speak, not having to perform or explain or make small talk. I just existed in that quiet, sipping my coffee, watching the light change. That's when I heard my own voice call out from somewhere deep in the forest behind me. Not an echo. I want to be very clear about that. I hadn't said anything. I'd been sitting in silence for at least 20 minutes. But the voice that came drifting through the pines was unmistakably mine. Same pitch, same cadence, same slight rasp I've had since I damaged my vocal cords in college. It called out a single word. Hello? My first thought was that I'd somehow vocalized without realizing it. Some unconscious utterance that had bounced back off the rocks. But the direction was wrong. The voice had come from inland, from the dense forest. not from the open air of the cliff edge where an echo would originate. And there was something off about the timing, the way the words seemed to hang in the air too long. I turned around, staring into the shadows between the pines. Nothing moved. The forest was still, that early morning stillness where even the birds haven't started their day yet. I waited, listening, my coffee going cold in my hands. Minutes passed. Nothing. I convinced myself it was some acoustic trick, sound traveling strangely in the thin mountain air. I turned back to the view, but the peace was broken now. The silence felt different, expectant rather than serene. 10 minutes later, my voice came again. This time it was closer, maybe 30 yards into the tree line. And this time it said something that froze the blood in my veins. "I know you can hear me." I stood up fast enough to spill my coffee. My heart was hammering now, adrenaline dumping into my system. I grabbed my hiking pole, holding it like a weapon, and called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin and frightened even to my own ears. The response came almost immediately, in my exact tone, with my exact inflection. "Who's there?" But it wasn't mocking me. It wasn't the playful repetition of someone trying to mess with a stranger. It was perfect mimicry, like a recording being played back. And then it added, in that same voice that was my voice, "You shouldn't have come back here." Back here. But I'd never been to this specific area before. I'd studied the maps. I knew this was virgin territory for me. Unless it meant something else. Unless it was talking about coming back to the rim in general, back to this kind of isolation. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Someone was following me. Someone had recorded my voice somehow. Someone was playing an elaborate, cruel prank. But even as I cycled through these explanations, I knew they were wrong. I was 3 days deep into wilderness. No one had been on this trail. I would have seen signs, footprints, campsites. I would have known. "What do you want?" I shouted into the forest. My voice cracked on the last word. Silence. Long enough that I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had moved on. Then my voice drifted out from a different direction, from the south now instead of the east. Closer. Maybe 20 yards. "I want you to understand something." A pause. And I could hear breathing in that pause, my own breathing pattern, the slight whistle I have from a deviated septum. The things you've been running from, they're still here. They've always been here. How did it know? The divorce I'd been processing, the reason I'd come out here alone in the first place, needing space and silence to work through the wreckage of a 15-year marriage. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here to escape, to run from the mess I'd left behind. But somehow this thing, this voice, knew. It knew the exact words that would cut deepest. I started backing toward my campsite, keeping my eyes on the tree line. "You're not real," I said, more to convince myself than anything. "You're not real." My voice laughed from the trees, a sound I recognized because it was how I laugh when I'm uncomfortable, when I'm trying to deflect from something painful. "Is that what you tell yourself? That the things you can't explain aren't real?" Another pause, and I heard the crack of a branch, something moving through the underbrush. "I'm as real as you are. I've always been as real as you are." I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran back to my tent and started breaking camp with shaking hands, stuffing my sleeping bag into its sack, yanking tent stakes out of the ground, not bothering to fold anything properly. I just needed to move, needed to get away from that overlook, from whatever was using my voice to speak things it shouldn't know. But as I worked, I kept hearing it. Circling me now, moving through the forest in a wide perimeter. Sometimes it would say things that sounded like encouragement. "You're doing great. Keep going." Sometimes it would whisper things I'd thought but never said aloud, private fears and shameful thoughts. "You know it was your fault. You drove everyone away. You deserve to be alone." Each statement in my voice, each one landing like a physical blow. The worst part was how it knew exactly when to speak and when to stay quiet. It would let silence build until I almost believed it was gone, until I started to relax. And then my voice would come from right behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck, even though nothing was there. "I'm not done with you yet." I got my pack on and started moving, not bothering with the trail, just heading in what I thought was the direction of the main road miles away. The forest was waking up now, birds starting to call, morning light filtering through the canopy. Normal sounds. Normal sights. But underneath it all, my voice kept following, kept speaking. It told me about the time I'd stolen $20 from my mother's purse when I was 13. It described the exact feeling I'd had watching my marriage fall apart, the specific flavor of relief mixed with grief. It recounted conversations I'd had with myself in empty rooms, the kind of desperate bargaining you do when you think no one's listening. How could it know these things? How could anything know these things? I hiked for 6 hours straight, barely stopping, driven by pure fear. My voice followed the entire way, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough that I'd spin around expecting to see myself standing there among the trees. It asked me questions I had no answers for. It made observations about my life that were so accurate they felt like violations. And worst of all, as the hours passed, I started to recognize something in the way it spoke. Not just my voice, but my thoughts. The exact phrasing I would use if I was talking to myself. By the time I hit the main road and flagged down a passing truck, my voice had faded to a whisper somewhere in the forest behind me. The last thing I heard it say, so quiet I might have imagined it, was, "I'll be here when you come back." The driver who picked me up asked if I was okay, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't a ghost I'd encountered. It was something wearing my voice like a mask, something that knew me better than I knew myself, something that had been waiting in that silence, listening for someone to come along and give it a sound to use. I still hear it sometimes, even now, even back in the city surrounded by noise and people. Late at night, when everything goes quiet, I'll hear my own voice calling from another room in my apartment. I'm still here. And I know, deep in my bones, that it's telling the truth. Whatever I met on the Mogollon Rim, it didn't stay there. It followed me home. And it's patient. It's so terribly patient. Waiting in every moment of silence, every gap in conversation, every quiet hour before dawn. Waiting to speak with my voice and tell me all the things I'm afraid to admit to myself. The silence isn't empty. It never was. And now I know what lives in it, wearing my voice like skin. I want you to picture this the way I remember it. The Mogollon Rim at 3 in the morning, fog lying low over the road like something alive, and my headlights catching nothing but white and the occasional glint of wet asphalt. I was already tired before the fog rolled in. I'd been hauling since early afternoon, trying to make it past that stretch before the real mountain weather started. The rim at night has its own personality. You feel it in the way the trees crowd the road, in the way your high beams seem to hit a wall of black instead of open space. That night, it felt like the forest had decided I'd seen enough and was going to close in on me, whether I liked it or not. I remember glancing at the clock on the dash, 3:02 a.m. No music, no radio chatter, just the low rumble of the engine and the occasional rattle from the trailer. Then the fog started, not gradual like you'd expect, but like someone had poured milk into the air. 1 second the road was clear, the next I was driving through a glowing white tunnel. My headlights bounced back at me, killing my visibility. I slowed to a crawl, hunched forward over the wheel, trying to pick out the faint suggestion of yellow lines beneath the haze. If you've ever driven in fog that thick, you know the feeling. The road seems to move under you instead of you moving over it, and every sense you have is screaming that you're about to slide off the edge into nothing. I was alone out there. No taillights ahead, no headlights in my mirrors. Just me, the truck, and that endless white, until the red lights appeared. At first, it was just a soft glow in the fog ahead, smeared like someone had dragged a paintbrush across a wet canvas. Then it sharpened into the familiar pattern of brake lights. One set became two. Two became four. Within another 30 seconds, I was rolling up on what looked like a full-blown traffic jam occupying both lanes of the highway. That shouldn't happen out there at that hour, not on that stretch. But there it was, a line of vehicles stretching into the fog as far as I could see. Cars, trucks, an old RV, even what looked like a classic pickup from the 60s, all sitting dead in the road with their hazards blinking in a slow, synchronized rhythm. Orange and red, flashing against the fog and painting the trees in sickly pulses. I eased off the gas completely, letting the rig roll to a stop behind a late-model SUV that still had dealership plates on it. At first, I felt relief. Good, I thought. If there's an accident up ahead, at least I'm not the only one stuck. I flipped on my own hazards, put it in neutral, and sat back to wait. That's when the quiet hit me. No doors opening, no voices, no engines idling, just the soft tick of my own hazard relay and the faint hiss of air brakes settling. I turned down the fan, just to listen. Nothing. The fog seemed to swallow sound as easily as it swallowed light. I blew a short tap on the air horn, expecting at least a wave from someone up ahead, some movement, some sign of life. The sound roared into the fog and died like it had hit a wall 5 feet in front of me. No reaction. No one leaning out of a window. No one stepping from behind a door. That uneasy feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize you're not supposed to be there crept over me then, invasive and cold. I told myself everyone was just sitting tight in their cars, half asleep like I'd been 5 minutes before. After a couple of minutes of staring at those unmoving hazards, I picked up the CB mic. Habit. Breaker, breaker. Anyone sitting in this mess on 260? You got eyes on what's going on up front? My voice sounded too loud in the cab. I let go of the button and waited, listening to the soft static. No response. Not even a stray trucker chatting on another channel. The line was dead quiet. I tried again. Different channel. Then another. On the third attempt, someone answered, but it wasn't what I expected. The voice that came back sounded strained, like the guy was trying hard not to panic. "You're seeing them too?" he asked. No handle, no greeting, just that flat, scared question. I swallowed. "Yeah," I said. "Whole line of vehicles with hazards on. Where are you sitting?" There was a pause, just white noise crackling over the speaker. "I'm not," he said finally. "Pulled over about a mile back. I've been watching them for 20 minutes. They're not moving. Nobody's getting out. Nobody's getting in." I felt a chill creep up my spine. I glanced in my side mirror out of reflex, half expecting to see a pickup pulled onto the shoulder behind me, but there was only fog glowing amber in the blink of my own hazards. "You sure you're not up here with me?" I asked. "What's your position?" Another pause. "I'm looking at you right now," he said quietly. "You're parked behind an SUV, right? White, new, with dealership plates. You're not where you think you are." I stared out through the windshield, then down at my GPS. The little truck icon sat exactly where it should be on the highway. "Look, friend," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If this is some kind of joke, I'm not in the mood." His answer came back fast, almost desperate. "Do you see exhaust?" he asked. The question was so simple, it threw me for a second. "What?" "Exhaust," he repeated. "It's cold out. Your breath is fogging up that cab, right? You see your own exhaust out there, coming out the back of those vehicles. Anything?" I leaned forward and squinted. He was right. Every vehicle within view was still, hazards blinking, but there was no sign of exhaust drifting from tailpipes, no faint shimmer of heat, nothing, just dead metal. "I'm getting out," I said, more to myself than to him. "Don't," the voice snapped back, urgent now. "Listen to me, driver. I've been watching. One guy tried that already. 10 minutes ago. Black pickup, 3 cars up from where you are now. He stepped out, walked up to the nearest car, opened the door. He didn't come back. Door's still open. Can you see it? My eyes went straight to where he said. There it was. A black pickup, hazards blinking, and 3 cars up from that, a sedan with its driver's side door hanging wide open. No one in the seat. No one between the vehicles. The fog swirled lazily through the gap, like it owned the place. I felt my heart thudding in my throat, my hand tightening on the wheel, hard enough to make my knuckles ache. The radio crackled again, but it wasn't the same voice. This time it was overlapping chatter, layers of panic bleeding into each other. They're walking around out there, but I can't see them, one voice said. Something's wrong with the time. It's not moving right, another voice insisted. I checked the channel number. It hadn't changed. I hadn't moved the dial. But suddenly it sounded like half a dozen people trying to talk at once, all of them describing things I couldn't see but could almost feel edging up against the edge of my perception. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise cut off. Nothing but static again. Hello? I said. You still there? The original voice came back, muffled, as if he'd moved the mic away from his mouth. You need to back up, he said. Easy as you can. Don't hit anything, don't get out. Just back up until you don't see them anymore. Backing a rig up a mountain highway, in the fog with an invisible drop-off on one side, is about as far from good practice as you can get. But I looked at that infinite line of motionless vehicles and felt something deeper than fear settle into my gut. It was the sense that I was sitting on the edge of something that wasn't meant for me. Like staring over a cliff you didn't realize was there until your toes were already hanging off. I eased the truck into reverse. The backup alarm sounded shrill and obscene in the fog-muted world. Slowly, inch by inch, I rolled backward. The hazards of the SUV in front of me faded into the mist, then the outline of its body. I kept going until there was nothing but white in my mirrors and ahead of me. No red glow, no orange flashes. Just fog and trees, and the dim impression of asphalt under my wheels. Okay, I said into the mic, breathing hard. I don't see them anymore. The voice on the other end let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. Good, he said. Now turn around. Go back the way you came. Don't stop. Don't look for me. I wanted to argue, to at least get a name, a location, something. But there was something in his tone that made argument feel childish. I found a wide enough spot a little ways back to execute the slowest, most careful 3-point turn of my life. As I swung the cab around, there was a moment, just one, where my headlights passed over empty highway that felt too empty, like a stage after the actors have left, set still standing. In that sweep of light, for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the outline of cars that weren't there, like after images burned into my vision. Then they were gone, and I was pointed back the way I'd come. I drove for 20 miles without touching the radio. When I finally did pick up the mic, intending to thank whoever had warned me, the channel was dead. No matter how many times I called, no matter how many channels I flipped through, that voice never came back. Later, at a gas station hours away, I asked the clerk if he'd heard about any pileup or traffic stoppage on the rim overnight. He shook his head. Nothing on the news, nothing on the scanners. The road had been quiet, he said. Dead quiet. Here's the part I can't shake, the detail that sticks in my mind like a splinter under the skin. When I checked my dash cam the next day, just to reassure myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing, the footage showed exactly what the clerk had said. Empty road, fog, my rig slowing to a stop in the middle of nowhere and idling for almost 10 minutes. Hazards, blinking alone in the night. No other cars, no red lights ahead, no line of vehicles stretching into the mist. Just me, sitting there like an idiot talking into a radio that recorded only my side of the conversation. I still run that route sometimes. You don't get to be picky about highways in this line of work. But whenever I hit that stretch near the rim in the small hours, and the fog starts to build, I feel my hands tighten on the wheel. I turn the radio down. I watch the darkness ahead like it might fill with red lights at any second. And if I ever see hazards blinking in the fog in front of me again, a whole line of them, perfectly still and perfectly wrong, I don't think I'll stop this time. I think I'll keep driving, no matter what I see in my headlights, because there are some traffic jams you don't want to be a part of, some gatherings that aren't meant for the living. I want you to imagine checking a camera and seeing your own face staring back at you from a place you know you weren't. Not just once, not as some glitch or reflection, but over and over, night after night, like another version of you had been out walking around while you slept. That's where this starts, out on the Mogollon Rim, in a stretch of forest I thought I knew better than I know most people, with a set of trail cameras I'd trusted for years. I set those cameras up to catch elk, bear, sometimes the odd mountain lion. I didn't set them up to catch whatever part of me the forest decided to borrow. I've been a hunting guide for a long time. The Rim has been my second home, my office, my church, whatever you want to call it. I know the game trails, the bedding areas, the water sources. I know where the elk move at dawn and where the coyotes like to sing at dusk. And I know how to work a grid with trail cams, so when I tell you these cameras were placed miles apart in areas I could map in my sleep, I mean it. That week had been slow. No clients, just me doing maintenance, checking on animal movement, planning for the next season. 5 cameras, all hung along a rough loop that would take me a full day to hike. The first weird thing was small enough that I almost ignored it. I pulled the card from the northernmost camera, tucked back in a stand of ponderosa overlooking a game trail slick with old hoofprints. I popped it into the reader, started flicking through the usual parade of deer backsides and raccoons. Then there was one frame that didn't fit. It was blurry, overexposed, and way too close. All I could make out was skin, eye, a suggestion of a nose, like someone had shoved their face inches from the lens. It creeped me out for a second, sure, but I wrote it off as some curious hiker who'd wandered too far in, or maybe even a prank from one of the other guides. People do stupid things when they find unattended gear. It was the timestamps that pulled the rug out from under me. That close-up shot was stamped 2:13 a.m., 3 nights prior. At that exact time, I was home. I could picture it because that was the night I couldn't sleep and ended up watching old westerns until 3. My truck hadn't moved. My phone location backed that up when I checked later. Still, I told myself, someone else must have gone poking around. The camera's location wasn't right off a trail, but people get curious. They wander. They find things they shouldn't. I hiked on to the second camera. It was set lower, angled across a dry wash that animals use like a highway. Same routine, card out, card in, scroll through. More animals, a few empty frames where wind had triggered the sensor, the usual. Then, halfway through the set, there it was again. My face. Closer this time, clearer. The shot was framed from just above the chin to just below the eyes. The focus had actually locked this time so I could see every line, every pore, the faint white scar on my cheek from when a branch got me years back. My mouth was relaxed, lips slightly parted like I was about to speak. My eyes were open and looking straight into the lens. The timestamp read 2:16 a.m. Same night, 3 minutes after the first camera's close-up. I just stood there with the card reader in my hand, feeling the forest press in around me. You know that prickling feeling when your brain catches up to something your body already knows is wrong. That's what hit me out there. Those 2 cameras were almost 2 miles apart, cross-country. Even if it had been me on both of them, even if I somehow sleepwalked out here without my truck moving, I couldn't have covered that distance in 3 minutes. I've seen glitches before, corrupt files, weird light artifacts, all sorts of tech gremlins. But this wasn't that. My face was too real, too specific. You don't glitch a scar into the exact right place. You don't glitch the tiny chip in one front tooth that I hate seeing in photos. By the time I reached the third camera, my heartbeat had settled into a sort of numb dread. You'd think I'd have turned around, headed back, chalked it up to some unsolvable weirdness. But out there, the forest is my workspace, and when something doesn't add up, I push through. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in the woods, but it's also the thing that keeps you alive, keeps you from stepping into a washed-out ravine or walking under a dead tree on a windy day. This camera was the one that bothered me from the day I installed it. It sat on the edge of a small meadow, the kind of bright opening that feels wrong at dusk because you're so used to the trees. The ground there always looked like it had been turned over, like it never settled, no matter how long it had been since the last rain. Animals liked it, though. I got great shots there. I remember thinking that as my fingers fumbled with the latch on the case, hands a little clumsy now. The card was almost full. Whatever had been moving through in the last week had been busy. I thumbed through frame after frame of elk legs, bobcat tails, once even a black bear's nose inches from the lens. Then, there I was again. This time, it wasn't a close-up. The camera had been triggered further back, and it caught my whole upper body. I was standing dead center in the meadow, facing the camera, arms at my sides. No backpack, no flashlight. Just me in the same worn jacket I was wearing at that exact moment, looking into the lens with a flat, unreadable expression. The timestamp, 2:19 a.m., 3 minutes after the last one, 6 minutes after the first. I want you to put yourself there with me for a second. You're standing in the same spot the photo shows, feeling the slightly soft, churned-up soil under your boots, smelling that dry pine needle and dust scent. You're looking at yourself standing where you are, wearing what you're wearing, at a time you know you were miles away. The air around you feels wrong. Not colder exactly, but heavier, like it's been used up. I check the rest of the frames. At 2:22 a.m., another shot. Closer, same expression. At 2:25, closer still, my face starting to fill the frame. Whatever version of me that was, it had been moving toward the camera in those perfect 3-minute increments, always straight on, always centered. By 2:28, it was another face shot, eye to eye, like the first camera. The last in the series was just a blur of skin and shadow, as if I'd moved right past the lens. That's when the feeling hit me that I wasn't alone out there, and not in the usual, there's probably a bear watching me from the trees way. This felt targeted, personal. Like something had studied me long enough to wear me correctly. I almost didn't go to the 4th and 5th cameras. I stood in that meadow breathing hard, every instinct telling me to head straight back to my truck. But there's a different kind of fear that takes over when you realize whatever is out there already knows you, already has your face. Running doesn't feel useful. Answers do. So I kept going. The 4th camera gave me more of the same. My face, my clothes, my body advancing toward the lens in 3-minute steps, timestamps marching along like a metronome. But the 5th camera, that one changed things. It was mounted along a narrow draw, the trees so close together their branches wove into each other. The ground there never fully dries, and the air always smells a little metallic, like old blood. I pulled the card. The progression started the same, 2:34, 2:37, 2:40. Me approaching, always centered, always straight on, but in the last few frames, something shifted. At 2:43, my head was tilted slightly, just enough that you could see more of one side of my face. At 2:46, it was more pronounced. At 2:49, my face was at a full angle as if I'd turned to listen to someone standing just outside the frame. And there, in the far right corner of that last clear shot between 2 trees, was another shape. Not clear, not lit, but wrong. Taller than me by at least a foot. Long-limbed, standing too close to the nearest trunk without disturbing a single branch. No eyes, no details, just the suggestion of mass and angle and a twisted outline that your brain tries to categorize and can't. The final recorded image taken at 2:52 a.m. was black. Not overexposed, not static, just darkness, like someone had covered the lens. The camera kept taking photos after that, triggered over and over, but they were all the same flat black until dawn. By the time I finished going through that card, my hands were numb. I don't remember the hike back to the truck in detail, just fragments. The weight of my pack biting into my shoulders. The way every crow call made me flinch. Checking over my shoulder so often I tripped on rocks I should have seen. Back home, I tried to rationalize. I checked the timestamps against my phone location, my security camera, anything that could prove I'd been where I remembered being. Everything lined up. I'd been at home, asleep or awake in front of the TV, while something wearing my body had been out in the forest visiting my cameras like it knew the route by heart. I still have the photos. I've shown them to a couple of people I trust. Everyone says the same thing. That's you. No doubt in their voice, no hesitation. One guy joked about me sleepwalking, driving my truck in my sleep. He stopped laughing when I pointed out the clothes in the images weren't the ones I'd worn that day before bed. They were the ones I'd laid out for the next morning. Now, when I go back on the rim, there are places I won't hike alone. There are days I feel eyes on me from somewhere just past the tree line, waiting to see what I do next so it can get it right. And I can't shake this one thought. Trail cameras only show you what happens in front of them. They don't show you what follows behind you step for step, wearing your face and waiting for you to turn around. I'm going to ask you to do something with me for this one. Don't just listen. Picture yourself there. Feel the ground. Smell the smoke. Because this story, it isn't about what I saw in the Mogollon Rim forest. It's about what followed me home from a circle of stones that had no right to remember my name. It started like a regular weekend trip. A group of us from a hiking club decided to camp near one of the lakes off the rim. Nothing dramatic. Just a couple nights under the stars to shake off the week. By the time we got there, the main spots were already taken. RVs, big family setups, people who'd claimed the best views early. We pushed further along the forest road, looking for a quieter place in the trees, something a little more isolated. I was the one who spotted the clearing. I wish I could tell you I felt something wrong about it from the start, that some instinct screamed at me to keep driving. The truth is, in that late afternoon light, it looked perfect. It was a wide, flat space ringed by tall pines, their trunks going straight up into that high Arizona sky. The ground was bare in the middle, packed dirt and old ash, with older stumps around the edge like seats that had been there for decades. There was already a rough circle of stones marking an old fire pit. At first glance, it looked like any other used campsite, just established, broken in, comfortable. We pulled the trucks in, started unloading gear, laughing, calling out to each other. It felt good. It felt normal. I noticed the stones first. Little things, off to the side of the fire ring. At the time, they just seemed like someone had tried to make it pretty. Small, flat rocks laid out in a larger circle around the main pit. They were different colors, different sizes, some partially buried, some sitting on the surface. I remember thinking someone had too much time on their hands, arranging them like that. I kicked one with my boot when I walked past, and it didn't budge. That should have clicked. How solid it felt, like it had been there for years. But the sun was dropping, the air was cooling off, and all I could think about then was getting a fire going. By the time it got properly dark, the forest had that deep layered quiet that makes every crackle of the fire sound huge. We were telling stories, passing around cheap beer, doing what campers do. At some point, one of the group pointed down at the dirt between the stones. "Hey, check this out," they said. We all leaned in, expecting some bug, some weird plant. Instead, I saw the faint outline of letters scraped into the hard-packed earth. The light from the fire made them dance, hard to read, but I could just make out a couple of letters. An initial, maybe. A date. Something about the way the dirt flaked at the edges told me it hadn't been done recently. That's when another one noticed different markings on the opposite side of the circle. Kneeling there in the firelight, I saw it properly. Each stone in that outer ring had something scratched near it in the soil. At first I thought coordinates, Then I realized they were names. Some were worn almost smooth, like they'd been stepped on for years. Others looked newer, the grooves still sharp. One of the newest ones made my stomach twist. It was my first name, clear as day, scratched into the earth where my boots had been an hour earlier. I hadn't written it. No one else admitted to it either. We laughed it off, of course. Stay in the woods long enough with friends, and everything turns into a prank. Somebody must have done it while I went to the truck. Somebody must have done it as a joke. The laughter felt thin, though, stretched over something that had suddenly gone very quiet. After that, the story stumbled and died. People drifted off to their tents earlier than they needed to, blaming the long day, the drive. I helped put out the fire, scattering the coals, dousing the pit until it hissed. Standing there in the dark with just the last glow of heat, I noticed something that pushed through all my rationalizations. The outer ring of stones looked closer, subtle, like an optical illusion. But I could have sworn there was more space between the fire pit and the stones when we arrived. Now they seemed tighter, as if they'd all crept an inch inward when we weren't watching. I told myself it was just the darkness, the shadows playing tricks. I kicked at one again as I passed by. It still wouldn't move. Sleep didn't come easy. You know that feeling in a tent where every rustle sounds like it's right beside your head. That was the kind of night it was. Wind in the trees, something small skittering over leaves, distant water lapping at the shore. Normal forest sounds, but they all felt amplified. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name etched into that dirt, fresh and raw, like the earth itself had decided to keep track of me. Sometime past midnight, I woke up with that sudden, heart-slamming alertness that doesn't come from a dream. It was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no insects, the kind of stillness that made my ears ring. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint scrape, like someone dragging something heavy across packed dirt, coming from just beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent. Slow, deliberate. Then another scrape, then another. I told myself it was one of the others getting up to use the bathroom, maybe kicking a rock without realizing it. But the sound had a pattern to it. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Always the same interval, like a measured heartbeat. It circled the tent once, then again. The third time, it stopped right at the entrance, just on the other side of the zipper. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My whole body tensed in that useless way, where you don't know whether to shout or stay silent. Without thinking, I whispered, "Who's there?" The answer didn't come from outside. It came from underneath me. A soft, grinding sound in the earth itself, so close I felt the vibration through my sleeping pad. Not a voice, not words, just movement, drag, shift, like something heavy was being pulled into place directly under where I lay. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. I just lay there, absolutely still, while the unseen thing under the ground reshaped itself. I must have blacked out or fallen into some kind of shallow, stunned sleep, because the next thing I remember is gray light seeping through the tent fabric. Morning. Birds were calling again. The air had that damp chill of early day. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been some anxious half-dream. Then I stepped out of my tent. The circle of stones had grown. There were more of them now, maybe a dozen, added to the ring. I counted automatically. There were exactly as many new stones as there were people in our group. Each one sat heavy and embedded, as if it had always been there. And near each new stone, the ground had been disturbed. Not much, just enough to see that the surface had been scraped, smoothed, and then marked. I walked over to the one in front of my tent. There, in fresh lines so clean they still held tiny curls of displaced dirt, was my full name. First, middle, last. The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's I recognized. Every letter was too precise, too uniform, like they'd been carved with a tool instead of drawn by a human hand. I called everyone out. They stumbled from their tents, hair messy, eyes squinting in the light, complaints dying on their lips as they saw what I was pointing at. Each one found their own name, written in the ground, paired with its own new stone. The jokes didn't come back this time. No one laughed. There was a lot of cursing, a lot of accusing looks, but under it all, a shared tremor. Because whoever, or whatever, had written those names had done it while we slept in a tight circle around that dead fire, our heads on the ground inches above where the marks had been carved. We broke camp faster than I've ever seen a group move. No one argued about staying. No one suggested it was harmless fun anymore. It felt like we were picking up and backing away from a wild animal crouched just outside of sight. Something that might lunge if we made one wrong move. As we loaded up the trucks, I forced myself to walk back to the ring one last time. I don't know why. Curiosity, fear, a need to see if the forest would react. The air above the stones felt colder. I stood over my name, over that fresh, jagged script, and said quietly, "You don't know me." The ground answered with a soft, almost inaudible crack, like drying mud splitting in the sun. The dirt around my name shifted by a fraction, just enough to distort one of the letters. It bent, twisted, turning a clean line into something that hooked downward, like a claw. That was all I needed. I turned and walked away, not running, not looking back, every instinct screaming at me not to show my back, but knowing that staying was worse. You'd think it would end there, with us driving out, the circle of stones shrinking in the rearview mirror, but it didn't. A week after that trip, I woke up in my apartment to a familiar smell, wood smoke and scorched earth, sharp and dry, completely out of place in my little city bedroom. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw it on the floor beside my bed. A small, flat stone, no bigger than my palm, sitting where my hand would fall when I swung out of bed. It was the same kind of stone that had been in that ring. Same color, same faint, mineral sheen when the light hit it. My first thought was that someone had brought it back as a joke, that one of the group had slipped it into my pack or pockets. But there were no marks on the floor, no dirt tracked in, no sign that stone had been anywhere but there, waiting. I picked it up. It was cold, heavier than it looked. On the underside, the side that had been resting against the floor, there was a faint scratch, the first letter of my name, half finished, like something had started writing it and been interrupted. I didn't keep it. I wish I could tell you I marched it straight out to the trash, or took it back to the forest, or something decisive like that. Instead, I carried it outside with shaking hands and left it on the concrete near the building dumpster, backing away like it might roll after me. When I checked an hour later, it was gone. No one in my complex owns a dog. No kids play in that lot. It had simply left, found someplace else to be. Since then, I've started noticing small piles of stones in places they don't belong. At the edge of a parking lot, in the corner of a stairwell at work, on the shoulder of the highway when I drive alone at night. Always circles. Always too neat, too deliberate. Sometimes, if I'm brave enough to look closely, I'll see a shallow scratch near one of them. A line that might be the start of a letter. I never stick around long enough to see if it finishes itself. Here's what I think now, and you can take this however you want. That circle we camped in wasn't just a fire ring someone fancied up. It was a record. A memory carved into the forest floor. Every stone a person who'd stood there. Every name a mark the place refused to let go of. We just gave it new entries, fresh inscriptions. And whatever lives under that packed dirt doesn't forget. It waits. It expands, stone by stone, name by name, until one night you wake up in your safe little bed miles away and realize part of you never left the rim at all. It's still out there, written in the ground around a dead fire, while the earth slowly pulls the circle tighter. You ever have a memory you can't line up with the clock? Like you know, down to the feeling in your bones, that something took hours, but every device around you swears it was only minutes. That's where this starts. Not with a monster in the trees or a shadow at the edge of the firelight, but with time itself slipping sideways on me up on the rim. If we were sitting across from each other right now, I'd probably lean in at this part, because this is where I always lose people. They think I'm talking about a bad dream. I wish I was. I'm a meteorologist by trade, which is a fancy way of saying I stare at screens and try to guess what the sky is going to do next. Most of my work is in front of radar and models, but every now and then I get sent out to ground truth something weird. Temperature inversions, strange pockets of fog, microbursts, stuff instruments pick up that doesn't quite make sense. That's what took me to the Mogollon Rim that week. A sensor network had been flagging odd nighttime temperature swings and dense localized fog events along a particular stretch of forest road, like the atmosphere was glitching in the same few square miles over and over again. I went alone. That's normal for my job. Truck loaded with instruments, a couple of portable weather stations, my laptop, and a dash cam because the department likes documentation. I parked for the night at a wide gravel pullout not far from a bend in the road, close enough to the rim that when I stepped out, I could smell cold air rising from the drop-off. It was early fall, warm days, sharp nights, the kind of evening where the sky feels too big and the stars look close enough to touch. I set up one tripod station near the truck and another a couple hundred yards down the road. Temp sensors, humidity, barometric pressure, anemometer, the whole little metal forest. I remember that part in detail. The clink of the tripod legs, the way my breath came out in quick bursts by the time I jogged back up the slight incline, the light from my headlamp swinging over the pines. I checked my watch, 11:41 p.m. The plan was to stay awake until about 2, grab cat naps if I had to, and monitored the readouts from the driver's seat with the laptop connected. The first hour was uneventful. A slow, steady temperature drop, a faint breeze shifting direction like it was thinking about settling in from the east. I sipped bad coffee from a thermos and listened to the truck tick as the engine cooled. Forest sounds came and went. An owl somewhere. A branch cracking under something's weight. The tiny random noises that mean this place is alive rather than something is wrong. I felt good. Tired but clear. Focused. Then, a little after midnight, I watched the fog appear. It didn't roll in like a tide the way you see in movies. It just thickened. One moment the trees across the road were sharp silhouettes, the next their edges went soft. My headlights, which I'd left on low beam, started to glow in their own light. The data lagged by about a minute, so I glanced down just in time to see the humidity graph spike upward. Temperature dipped sharply, a clean drop like someone had thrown a switch. Wind speed flatlined. You know that feeling when a plane hits dead air and your stomach briefly forgets where the ground is. It was like that, but with the air itself. The truck suddenly felt like the only real object in a world made of cotton. Every sound outside got swallowed. When I cracked the window to listen, even the faint hiss of wind was gone. The silence pushed in. Here's where the timeline gets slippery. I remember checking the clock on the dash. 12:08 a.m. I remember telling myself I'd give it 20 minutes, watch the readings, then maybe reposition. I leaned back, eyes flicking between the laptop graphs and the hazy world beyond the windshield. I remember my own breathing slowing down, the window glass fogging slightly with each exhale. At some point, my eyes must have closed. The next thing I knew, bright sunlight was searing into my face. No in-between, no groggy half-dreams, just instant violent daylight. My neck ached from the angle I'd been sleeping in. My spine protested when I jerked upright. For a few wild seconds, I thought I'd gone blind because all I could see was white. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized it wasn't blindness. It was fog, only now lit from above, glowing, so bright it hurt. The clock on the dash said 7:26 a.m. My first thought was irritation. I'd done the cardinal sin of fieldwork, fallen asleep on a live recording. I grabbed for the laptop, heart sinking, already rehearsing the half-truths I'd tell in my report. But when I looked at the data, my irritation folded into something cold and hollow. There was nothing. The graphs ran smooth up until 12:11 a.m. Temperature drop, humidity spike, wind speed 0, and then flat lines, like the sensors had all gone offline simultaneously. No spiky errors, no noise, just a perfectly straight nothing until 6:59 a.m., when they all woke up again in one clean jump. It was as if the atmosphere had taken a 6-hour break and then remembered to exist. I told myself it was a tech failure, even as that felt wrong. 6 independent instruments all dying and resurrecting at the same time. I clung to the explanation. The alternative was admitting the gap matched my missing time a little too neatly. I opened the door to step out and check the equipment, intending to blame loose cables or battery packs. The air that hit me was wrong. It smelled like early morning forest and something else. A faint tinge of metal, like the air after a lightning strike, with a sour undertone that made my tongue flash with the taste of old pennies. The fog was still thick, but oddly uniform. No patches, no shifting patterns, just a consistent white wall about 20 feet out in every direction. I walked carefully to the nearest tripod, boots crunching on gravel. Everything looked fine. Batteries full, cables seated, no condensation inside the housings. I ran gloved fingers along the mast, more to feel something solid than anything else. When I turned back toward the truck, my stomach dropped. I was farther away than I should have been. This is the part I always struggle to explain. Distances up there are intuitive to me. You walk a line enough times, your body memorizes how many strides it takes, how your breath feels at certain points. The pullout where I'd parked was not big. I knew, with the same certainty you know the layout of your own living room, exactly how many steps from driver's door to that nearest instrument. Except there I was. And my truck looked small, too small, like I'd walked twice the distance I'd meant to without realizing it. I started counting out loud as I headed back. 1, 2, 3, each step deliberate. It took me 33 strides to reach the door. The night before, setting up, it had taken me 17. I could have chalked that up to grogginess, misjudgment, anything, if not for what the dash cam showed me. Back in the cab, I mounted the camera's SD card into the laptop. On the screen, night froze into pause static. The road, framed by my headlights, trees fading into darkness. I hit play. Time code, 12:06 a.m. I watch myself in the reflection faintly visible in the window. Head back, eyes drooping, fingers still on the laptop keyboard. The fog outside thickened over the next few minutes until even the road vanished. Then, at 12:11 a.m., something flickered. Every pixel on the screen seemed to pull inward just a fraction of an inch before snapping back. Like reality had taken a deep breath. The audio cut out. No engine hum, no faint whine from the electronics. Just absolute digital silence. The time code on the recording kept running. 12, 12, 12:13. But the image didn't change. The truck interior remained a still frame of me half asleep, frozen mid-blink. Outside the windows, white. At 7:02 a.m., it all lurched back into motion. One frame, I was slumped, eyelids drooping. The next, I jerked upright, sunlight blasting through the glass. No in-between, no 6 hours of footage. It was like someone had taken a razor to the file and cut out the middle, then glued the loose ends together. But the time code never paused. It just rolled on smoothly, as if it had faithfully watched nothing at all for almost 7 hours. My mouth went dry. Something cold pressed against the back of my neck from the inside, as if my own nerves were turning to ice. I scrubbed back and forth over the cut, frame by frame, watching the same instantaneous shift. Dark to light, stillness to motion. And then, on what must have been the 25th replay, I saw it. One frame before everything came back. Just one. The whiteness outside the driver's window wasn't smooth. There, pressed right up against the glass, was the faintest suggestion of a shape. Not a face. Not anything so straightforward. More like an absence, a vaguely human-sized distortion, darker than the fog around it, with an edge that hinted at shoulders, a head tilted toward me. And then it was gone. Daylight. Me, lurching awake. I closed the laptop. Every instinct screamed at me to get off that road. I packed the gear in a rushed, clumsy blur, tossing tripods into the bed without their usual careful folding. I didn't bother logging anything. I just wanted distance. Here's the thing, though. The distance didn't feel right on the way out either. According to my phone's GPS, it took me 40 minutes to reach the main highway. According to the truck odometer, that was spot on for the miles. But my body said I'd been driving for longer. My eyes burned with that raw, sandy ache you get after hours on the road, not 40 minutes. My shoulders were knotted as if I'd been pinned tense over the wheel all night. The clock and my muscles weren't telling the same story anymore. Back home, I tried to rationalize. Corrupted SD card, I told myself. Environmental interference with the sensors. Maybe some weird microclimate that made distances feel off. I wrote my report in the driest language I could manage, trimming away anything that sounded like feeling. Sensor outage between 00 and 0700 hours. Potential localized EM anomaly affecting equipment. I didn't mention the shape at the window. I didn't mention the taste of metal in the air or the way my own memory felt shaved down to a before and after with nothing in between. Then, a week later, my phone woke me up at 3:14 a.m. It was the notification chime from my dash cam app, one I'd forgotten I even had set up for motion alerts when the vehicle was parked. The truck was in my apartment complex lot, 3 floors, and a world away from the rim. Blinking, half asleep, I opened the clip. The interior of my truck appeared, lit dimly by a street lamp. The driver's seat was empty. Outside, in the corner of the frame, I could see the outline of other parked cars. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then the driver's window fogged over from the outside, a slow bloom of condensation in the exact pattern my breath had made up on the rim. The glass clouded, then cleared, like something unseen had leaned close, exhaled, and pulled away. The time code on that clip ran normally. No cuts, no missing hours. But watching it, feeling my heart slam against my ribs in the dark of my bedroom, I realized something that made my skin crawl in a way nothing on the rim had managed. Whatever stepped into that missing time with me hadn't stayed in the forest. It had found its way into the dead space between seconds and followed me home through the gap. People ask why I don't go out on field assignments alone anymore. I usually joke about getting soft, about preferring office chairs to camp chairs. The real reason is this. I don't trust time when I'm by myself now. I don't trust long stretches of quiet where no one else can vouch for what happened, because up on that rim, there is at least one place where 6 hours can vanish without leaving so much as a blip on a graph. And something in that blank space is paying attention to anyone who notices. I want to start this one with a feeling you probably know, even if you've never hunted a day in your life. That animal part of you that wakes up before the rest. The part that says, don't move, don't breathe, don't even blink because something is too close. That's the part that saved me on the Mogollon Rim, sitting in a deer stand with the sky just starting to think about turning gray, while something that wasn't supposed to move like a human or an animal climbed the tree to meet me. I'd been hunting that patch of rim country for years. There's a kind of loyalty that develops between you and a piece of land when you keep going back to it. Through dry years and heavy snow, good seasons and bad. This spot was mine. A narrow drainage that opened into a small clearing with a well-used game trail cutting across like a promise. I'd hung my stand in a ponderosa that leaned just enough to give me a clean angle. The bark on that trunk was familiar to my hands, the knots and scars like old friends. I trusted that tree almost as much as I trusted my own legs. That morning, the forest felt quiet in the way it does when a hard frost is just lifting. The ground was crisp under my boots on the hike in, each step crunching just enough to make me wince. I got into the stand about an hour before first light, climbed the ladder, settled in with my bow, and let the dark shrink around me. Up there, maybe 15 feet off the ground, the air felt different. Colder, thinner, like I'd climbed out of the world's shallow part and into its lungs. If we were sitting together right now, I'd tell you this next part slowly, because it's the last time in the story that anything felt normal. I remember the smell of sap from a broken branch near my knee. I remember the faint, distant yip of a coyote, the rustle of something small in the grass. I remember the way my own breath formed a tiny cloud in the beam of my headlamp when I checked my watch. Everything fell into that familiar rhythm of waiting. You listen. You watch. You let the forest forget you're there. The first thing that told me something was wrong was the silence. Not all at once. More like someone was slowly turning down a dial on the background noise. The coyote went quiet. The little rustles in the grass stopped. Even the wind in the needles above me seemed to ease off, like the whole canopy was holding its breath. The only sound left was my own pulse in my ears, louder now that it had nothing to compete with. Then I heard the breathing. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know the difference between animal breathing and human breathing. Deer huff, bears snort, coyotes pant, and they all have their own rhythm. This was none of those. This was slow and measured, deeper than mine, but trying to match it. Inhale when I inhaled, exhale when I exhaled. At first, I thought I was just hearing my own breath echoing weirdly in my hood, some acoustic trick, but the sound wasn't coming from my chest. It was coming from the trunk of the tree itself, just below my boots. I froze. My hand tightened on the bowstring without me meaning to draw it. I didn't dare look down right away. I just sat there, counting in my head, 1, 2, 3, and listening. The breathing stayed with me, a half beat behind, like someone trying to sync up with my lungs and almost getting it right. On the fourth breath, curiosity beat fear. I tilted my head down slow enough that the harness didn't creak. There was nothing on the ladder, just the dark shape of it, fading into shadow, the lower rungs disappearing into the gloom at the base of the tree. I could barely make out the ground, just a suggestion of lighter gray where the clearing opened up. No shape, no figure, nothing that should have been making that sound. I forced myself to take another breath, listening for the echo. Inhale, exhale. Right under my boots, the tree inhaled with me. I felt it more than heard it that time. A subtle expansion in the wood, like the trunk itself was taking air. The bolt heads near my feet vibrated, the metal of the stand frame humming against my soles. The bark pressed into the rubber of my boots as if the tree was flexing its muscles. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to get down, to run. But there's nowhere to run when you're strapped into a metal seat bolted to something that just started acting alive in all the wrong ways. I gripped the side rail to steady my hands. The bark under my glove felt warm. Not just not cold, but almost body temperature, as if someone had been leaning there until a second ago. My eyes adjusted more to the pre-dawn dark, and that's when I noticed it. The shadow of my own stand wasn't right. It should have fallen straight down in a neat rectangle on the trunk. Instead, it bulged in places, like the tree beneath had grown new ridges and angles overnight. I made the mistake of looking further down, about 6 feet below me. Where the trunk should have been clean and straight, something was wrapped around the tree. At first, I thought it was a massive vine, some kind of strangler growth I'd somehow missed in the daylight, but vines don't have joints. This had elbows. It was shaped like an arm, long and too thin, the hand pressed flat against the bark, as if it were hugging the tree. The fingers, if you could call them that, were too many and too long, splayed out like roots gripping into the wood. For a second, my brain refused to understand what it was seeing. It tried to catalog it as a trick of the shadows, some weird burl on the trunk. Then the fingers flexed. The tips dug into the bark without making a sound, and the entire limb shifted, pulling something attached to it a few inches up the tree. The bark didn't crack. The trunk didn't groan. The thing climbed like it had always belonged there, like the tree was helping. My harness felt suddenly too tight across my chest. Sweat ran cold down my back despite the chill air. I know, in that moment, I should have been reaching for my knife, my bow, something. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Slow as a spider, that long, jointed limb pulled the rest of the creature into view. Calling it a creature feels wrong, like I'm making it into some cartoon monster. What came around the trunk under my stand looked like the idea of a person someone had carved into the forest and then stretched until the proportions stopped being humane. It had a torso, lank and narrow, pressed so close to the bark it almost blended in, skin the color of old wood. Its legs, what I could see of them, hung straight down, one on each side of the trunk, but bent backward at the knees like a bird's. As it climbed, those bent legs didn't kick or scrabble. They just slid, adjusting around knots and imperfections without ever fully lifting off the surface. Its head was the worst part. It didn't have a face in the way you and I do. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just an oval of smoother, paler texture that pulsed faintly as it moved, like something breathing through its skin. Where a face should have been, the tree itself seemed to be bulging inward toward it, as though the bark was trying to meet that blankness halfway. And somehow, even with that empty oval turned up toward me, I knew it was looking right at me. The breathing matched mine perfectly now. Inhale. Its chest, or what passed for one, rose against the trunk. Exhale. The fine hair-like growths along its limbs quivered. It was so close I could see those details, even in the low light. Close enough that if I leaned over, I could have touched the top of that too smooth head. The stand frame barely separated my boots from the place where its upper arms braced, joints bending wrong, angles too sharp. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me welded to the seat, it clinging to the tree, both of us breathing in sync. Time stretched thin, the sky lightened by degrees around us, the first hints of color creeping over the horizon. But up there, in that little slice of forest, it felt like dawn couldn't quite break through as long as it held its position. Then I made another mistake. I thought about moving. I didn't move. I swear to you, I didn't shift a muscle. But that animal part of my brain, the one that calculates escape paths and screams not yet, must have fired off a different pattern, because the second I decided I would wait until it moved, then unclip and climb down the far side, its head tilted. Not much. Just enough that the blank oval was no longer angled directly at me, but at the line of my harness strap. Slowly, with that same fluid, silent motion, the hand nearest my foot started to rise. The fingers uncurled from the bark, each one leaving a faint, damp imprint in the wood that steamed in the cold air. They reached toward the strap, toward the buckle that held me there. I don't remember deciding to do it. 1 second, terror had me pinned. The next, I heard my own voice in my head as clear as if I'd said it out loud. Now. I threw myself sideways, not thinking about the drop, just about not letting those fingers touch the harness. Metal groaned. Bark scraped under my boots, and then gravity did what it does. The world lurched. The stand didn't give completely. One of the bolts held, but the frame twisted hard enough that I slammed into the tree shoulder first. Pain exploded down my arm. I felt the harness strap bite into my ribs as my weight hit it. Above me, the safety line snapped taut. For a moment, I hung there at an angle, one boot still on the platform, the other kicking in air, the creature's reaching hand passing inches from my chest. It recoiled, not like an animal startled by sound, more like something offended by physics. Its whole body withdrew a few inches, limbs pulling in, torso flattening even closer to the trunk. The tree seemed to ripple with it, bark flexing like muscle. Then, in a movement so fast and smooth it made my eyes water, it slid around the far side of the trunk and out of my sight. Not down, not up, just away, folding itself into the tree's shadow like it had never been there at all. The forest sounds came back in a rush. A bird called. The wind picked up, rustling the needles above. My own breathing went ragged and uneven, no longer matched by anything but my pounding heart. I hung there for a few seconds, waiting for a hand to grab my ankle from behind the trunk. Nothing touched me. Adrenaline is a strange thing. It'll make you do impossible-feeling tasks on autopilot. I got one boot back onto the twisted platform, grabbed the ladder with my good arm, unhooked the harness with fingers I couldn't feel, and climbed down without dying. Every rung felt like it could give way. Every scrape of my boot on metal sounded too loud, but nothing reached for me. Nothing followed. On the ground, the tree looked perfectly normal. Tall, straight, sun just catching the upper branches. No marks on the bark except the usual scars and cracks. No sign of limbs, or extra joints, or anything that could have held something like that to the trunk. When I put my hand where I'd seen its chest pressed, the bark was cool, completely, utterly ordinary. I took the stand down that same day, loosened the bolts with shaking hands, lowered it piece by piece, loaded it into the truck. I told myself I was done with that spot, that I'd never climb that particular tree again. But the thing is, it's not just that tree anymore. Now, whenever I drive past a stand of tall, straight pines on the rim, I catch myself watching the trunks instead of the branches, looking for the slightest hint of movement that isn't wind, listening for breathing that isn't mine riding up and down in the cab, because up there, where the forest has had centuries to learn the shape of every animal that's ever touched its soil, I met something that didn't choose a shape of its own. It chose mine. It studied me long enough to climb the same tree, match the same breaths, and reach for the one thing keeping me suspended. People talk about being watched in the woods like it's some vague feeling. I know better now. Sometimes it's not just eyes you need to worry about, it's hands. Hands that know exactly where you're tied in and how far you have to fall. I'm going to tell you about the one night on the rim when the ground stopped believing in gravity, and how it feels when the thing you've always trusted most, down, is suddenly up for debate. If you've ever leaned over a railing and felt that pull in your stomach, that whisper to jump, then you already know the first layer of what I'm about to describe. Now stretch that feeling out over hours, and imagine the railing starting to lean back toward you. I wasn't up there for thrills. I was there to work. I guide climbers. Nothing fancy, just technical enough to keep people from killing themselves on the prettier pieces of Arizona. The overlook I'm talking about isn't on any map you'd find at a gas station. It's a little spur of rock off one of the rim roads, a place we use to practice multi-pitch anchors because the drop is clean and brutal, and the view, well, it used to be worth the nerves. You stand there at the edge and there's just air beneath you for hundreds of feet, trees below looking like green lint stuck to the earth. That evening, it was just me and one client. We'd topped out late, later than planned, because of some faffing around with gear on the last pitch. By the time we hauled everything over the lip, the sun was already bleeding into the horizon. The light went, that strange color it gets up there, where everything's too sharp and too flat at the same time. I anchored us in at a safe distance from the edge, set up a bivvy on a flattish patch near a scrub pine, and told myself it was fine. I've slept on ledges much worse than that little shelf. Besides, the weather was calm. No storms, just cold stars waiting to come out. You know that special kind of tired you get when your muscles are used up but your brain is still humming? That's where I was. We ate, we talked a little, and then my client zipped into their bag and went quiet. I lay there in mine, half in the tent, half out under the open sky, listening to the forest breathe below. Wind in the trees, an occasional distant bark, the low susurrus of night settling into its routine. Normal, comforting even. The first odd thing was so small I almost missed it. A coin of all things. I heard a faint clink right next to my head. That tiny metal on rock sound. I turned my headlamp on and saw a quarter hovering maybe 3 inches above the ground beside me. Not falling, just hanging there, perfectly still, like someone had glued it to the air. For a full second, my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I reached out thinking it had to be caught on a thread of spiderweb or something. My fingers brushed cold metal, and the instant I touched it, it dropped, hit the rock with a flat slap, spun, and settled. My hand was shaking, light from my headlamp jittering over the stone as if I'd had 3 cups of coffee instead of 1. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes had played a trick, and I was just slow catching the movement. I even laughed softly, because the alternative, gravity stopped working for a second, doesn't fit anywhere good in the brain. I picked up the quarter. It was normal. Dull, scratched, someone's laundry money. I put it in my pocket like that would make the moment less weird. Then the bottle cap appeared. It slid into my peripheral vision a few minutes later, glinting in the lamplight from where it hung in the air near the tent flap. This time I watched it, watched how it wasn't falling, wasn't rising, just suspended, not even spinning, just there. The ground beneath it was bare rock, nothing that could catch it, nothing it could rest on. I didn't touch that one. I just stared until my eyes watered, and then I did the thing I probably shouldn't have done. I leaned over and put my hand underneath it, palm up. It didn't fall. My skin passed into the same invisible layer that was holding it, and for a moment, we were both just there, my hand and the metal cap hanging in the same impossible slice of space. I could feel it, not the object, but the line. A plane, maybe 4 inches off the ground, where the world changed its mind about which way down was. It tingled against my palm, a faint fizz like when your arm falls asleep. The hairs on my wrist rose. I jerked my hand back, heart kicking hard in my chest. The bottle cap finally chose a direction and dropped to the rock. That tiny, ordinary sound, metal on stone, suddenly meant something. It meant there were rules, and something right here on this little patch of rim had started using different ones. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, with the lamp off, watching the thin strip of rock around me, every sense turned up too high. My client snored quietly a few feet away, blissfully unaware. The stars wheeled overhead. And then, one by one, more things began to float. It started with the small stuff. Grit, little pebbles, a stiff pine needle that had been lying flat near my boot. They twitched, lifted, and stopped at the same height as the quarter and the bottle cap had. A straight, invisible line in the air. Within half an hour, the ground between my tent and the edge of the overlook was patterned with tiny objects suspended in a grid, each one exactly the same distance above the rock. I watched a pebble rise right out of a crack at my feet, slow and steady, as if someone was turning a dial. It didn't bob. It didn't drift. It just elevated and then held. I could have slipped my hand under it, but I didn't this time. I already knew how that felt. Instead, I turned my head toward the edge of the cliff. The pattern stretched all the way out. Coins someone had dropped over the years. Old tabs from beer cans. A lost carabiner scarred from use. A single sun-bleached feather. All of them hanging in the air across the flat rock, marking out a grid that extended toward the drop. It should have looked ridiculous, like some art installation. It didn't. It looked surgical, precise, like a cross-section had been cut out of reality and marked with pins. I don't know when I realized my body felt light. It crept up on me. First, it was just the sense that my sleeping pad wasn't biting into my hips the way it usually did on hard ground. Then the feeling that my chest was too hollow when I breathed, like there wasn't enough weight holding me down. I shifted, and the motion felt exaggerated, my elbow floating up a little too easily. Instinct tightened every muscle I had, like tension alone could glue me in place. I whispered my client's name, no response. They were dead asleep, bags zipped up, oblivious to the fact that the rules we count on were flexing under us. I didn't call again. Some terrified animal part of me believed that making noise would draw attention. Not just theirs, but something else's. The grid of floating debris thickened. Objects that had been lying under bushes, tucked into crevices, hidden from casual glances, eased out and claimed their little squares in the air. I watched an old rusted bolt emerge from a crack with a delicate sort of determination, as if the rock was reluctantly letting it go. It rose, joined the others, and stilled. And then the line started to move. Not fast, not dramatic, just up. Maybe a millimeter every few minutes. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been staring, but I was, and I saw it. The quarter, now well clear of the ground, slowly climbing. The feather, the bottle cap, all of them maintaining their perfect formation as the whole plane lifted. The wave of it moved across the overlook, away from the tree line and toward the void. That's when the lightheadedness hit me, not just nerves. A real physical sensation of my insides going loose. The contact points between my body and the rock felt thinner, like there was less gravity flowing through them. When I flexed my calves, my heels almost left the ground without effort. The harness I'd worn all day felt too light around my waist. I remember, very clearly, the thought that came next. If this keeps going, we're going to lift off. It didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as fact. Mathematical, almost. The grid was rising. The ground's pull was easing. We were on top of a 200-plus foot drop. There were only 3 possible outcomes. It stopped, we climbed down before it didn't, or we went up and whatever was doing this decided where we ended up. I reached over and shoved at my client's shoulder. Harder than I meant to. "Wake up," I hissed. My voice sounded wrong in the thin air. They jerked awake, immediate confusion in their eyes as they fought their way out of their bag. "Don't stand up fast," I said. "Just feel." They did. And I saw the moment it hit them too. That sick floating sensation like the first jump on a roller coaster stretched out forever. Their hands grabbed for the rock, nails scraping as if they expected to slip. The grid had already climbed another inch. Little objects now hung at our shins, then our knees, then slowly crept higher. The ones closest to the edge were a bit ahead, as if whatever was pulling was stronger out there. It was like watching a tide roll out in reverse, but vertical. My head spun. For a few terrifying seconds, my body couldn't decide which way was down. The sky above and the dark valley below both felt like they were taking turns trying to be the floor. "We need to get off this slab," I said. My voice came out tight, too calm. "Crawl, stay low. Don't jump, don't stand, just crawl back toward the trees." We must have looked pathetic, scrabbling across the rock on hands and knees, dragging our gear behind us. Every move felt exaggerated and slow, as if we were underwater. More than once, my palm slid out further than I meant it to, my center of gravity tilting in a way that made my stomach lurch. Every time that happened, I felt an upward tug, subtle but real, like something was curious about whether I'd let go. Behind us, the floating grid kept rising. By the time we reached the rougher ground near the scrub pine, the objects nearest the edge were hovering at waist height. The quarter I'd pocketed earlier pulled itself free without my consent. I felt it lift inside my jacket first, a gentle tug against the fabric, and then it slipped up and out through the unzipped edge like a fish darting for a current. It joined its place in the grid, not wobbling, not spinning, just taking its position. We didn't stop at the tree. We pushed into the uneven, root-tangled soil beyond the clean rock, where the forest floor rose and fell in lumps and mounds. With every foot we gained away from the overlook, gravity grew teeth again. The lightness faded, replaced by the honest weight of our bodies pressing into the ground. My knees started to ache. My breaths came harder. For once in my life, I was grateful for how heavy my pack felt. We collapsed finally against a stand of young pines, maybe 20 yards back from the overlook. From there, we could still see the edge, the open sky beyond, and the grid. It hung now like a second artificial horizon over the drop. Coins, caps, carabiners, pebbles, all suspended at chest height for a tall person, then neck, then head. Above that, nothing. Below, empty air. I don't know how long we sat there, pressed into the dirt, watching the line rise. Time blurred. The stars spun. At some point, the grid began to thin. One by one, objects winked out. Not falling, just vanishing. Like whatever was doing this had drawn them past some threshold, and then lost interest. The last thing I saw was that feather, now a pale ghost in the darkness, slipping upward until the night swallowed it. When the sun finally bled back into the world, the overlook looked normal. Empty rock, no debris, no grid. If anything, it was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. As if years of human trash had been skimmed away. We edged back to the opening in full daylight, hearts beating double time, and looked over. The valley floor lay where it always had. Trees, cliffs, no evidence that anything had come loose. I tested the ground with a boot, then both feet, then a small jump, solid, heavy, ugly, ordinary gravity dragging me back the way it's supposed to. My client laughed then, a thin, hysterical sound, and I joined in because the alternative was something worse. I've been on that overlook since, not often, and never at night. In the harsh, honest light of midday, there's nothing strange about it. Climbers still trust their ropes to that drop. Tourists still walk too close to the edge, taking selfies with their backs to a fall that doesn't care about them. But I know there's at least one night, maybe more, when the rim lets go of its grip just enough to see what floats. Now, whenever I'm near any cliff, any balcony, any edge, I find myself watching for the little things. A leaf that doesn't quite land, dust motes that hang a fraction too long in a sunbeam. The moment when your footstep feels lighter than it should. Because if the world can choose, even for a few hours, to move the line where down begins, then all the trust we put in rock and railings and floors is just habit. And habit won't save you if you happen to be standing in the wrong place on the wrong night when the rim decides to take inventory again. Let me ask you something before we start. Have you ever heard yourself in a recording and thought, that doesn't sound like me? Now imagine that feeling, but it isn't a recording. It's your voice answering you, arguing with you, correcting you in real time from somewhere you can't see. That's what happened to me on the Mogollon Rim, out in the dark with a cheap radio and a signal that should not have existed. I'm not a hiker or a hunter like most people who end up with stories about that place. I'm a radio nerd. That's my whole thing. While other people go up to the rim for views and lakes and campfires, I go for clean airwaves. Less interference, fewer buildings, a big empty sky to bounce signals off. I'd been chasing this rumor for a while, people talking on ham forums about a ghost frequency up near the rim that would mirror your call with a delay. Creepy, sure, but to me it sounded like a challenge. Probably some experimental repeater, I told myself. Some weird atmospheric ducting, something I could explain if I got close enough with the right gear. So I went up alone on a weeknight, when the campgrounds were mostly empty and the forest roads were just lines of washboard cutting through the pines. I parked in a pullout not far from the edge, killed the engine, and let the night settle around me. It was one of those clear, cold evenings where the stars look like they're dusted onto black glass. The air smelled like pine sap and distant smoke from some fire I couldn't see. I set up a folding chair next to the truck, clipped a small antenna to the roof rack, and pulled my handheld radio from my jacket. If you were sitting here with me, I'd hand that radio to you so you could feel how ordinary it is. Scuffed plastic, tape residue on the back where I'd labeled frequencies. Nothing mystical about it. I scrolled through my usual channels, listening to the familiar background noise. Static, an occasional burst of distant chatter, nothing unusual. Then I switched to the range people had been whispering about online, somewhere between where normal ham traffic lives and the quiet spaces you're not really supposed to mess with. At first, it was just hiss. That soft, endless shh of open airwaves. I adjusted the squelch, tapped the casing like that would help, and said the most boring thing in the world into the mic. Test. 1, 2, 3. My own voice went out into the night, small and flat. The static swallowed it. Then, about 30 seconds later, I heard myself say the same words back. Test. 1, 2, 3. You know how recordings sound a little off? Tinny, distant, like your voice had been flattened out and pressed onto a cheap disc? This wasn't that. The voice that came back had the full shape of my words in it. The same rough edge I hear when I'm tired. The exact little hesitation on the one I hadn't even realized I'd done. It came through with the kind of clarity you don't get in the field. No background noise, no static, just me, talking from somewhere else. I froze with the radio still in my hand, thumb hovering over the transmit button. I told myself it had to be some kind of bounce, maybe a repeater somewhere picking me up and relaying my test. But I hadn't identified myself properly, hadn't used any standard call sign. There was no reason for anyone to answer, let alone with the exact same words I'd just said. Hello? I tried. My voice shook a little that time. Is somebody out there rebroadcasting me? Static for a few heartbeats. Then, 30 seconds later, the reply, hello? Is somebody out there rebroadcasting me? Same cadence, same nervous edge. The only difference was that this time, layered under my echoed words, there was something else. A faint rustling, like wind in trees that weren't matching the still air around me. And behind that, something that might have been breathing. Slow, deliberate, not mine. I checked my watch. I checked the time on my phone. I listened to the forest around me, the real forest. The one that still smelled like cold and pine and far-off fire. It was quiet except for the occasional insect, the creak of a tree shifting as the temperature dropped. No other radios, no other people that I could see. Just me and my own voice, now coming back at me from an empty channel. Being who I am, I didn't leave. I should have. Anyone with basic survival instincts would have packed up and driven straight back to town. But I wanted to understand it. That curiosity has teeth, and that night it bit down hard. I decided to test it. Okay, I said into the mic, forcing my voice to sound calmer than I felt. If you're me, or if you're just throwing my words back, I'm going to say something I've never said into a radio before. I swallowed. I'm sitting in a folding chair next to a gray pickup truck. I am wearing a red jacket. I'm holding this radio in my right hand. I let go of the button and stared at the timer on the radio's tiny screen. 25 seconds. 28. At exactly 30, the answer came. I'm sitting in a folding chair next to a gray pickup truck. I'm wearing a red jacket. I'm holding this radio in my right hand. That should have been impossible, not the repeat. That pattern had already established itself. But what came after? My echo didn't stop when I did. It kept going smoothly, without the little hitch where I'd let go of the button. My left foot is tapping. My hands are shaking. I'm thinking about leaving, but I won't. I never do. My gaze dropped, and sure enough, my left foot was tapping against the dirt, small nervous kicks I hadn't even noticed. My fingers were trembling around the radio, plastic creaking under my grip. And it was right about the part where it said I wouldn't leave that I realized I was nodding along to my own prediction, like the words had already settled into place inside me. The air around my chair felt thicker, not colder, just crowded somehow, like the space I occupied had been compressed. I said the first defensive thing that came to mind. You don't know what I'm going to do. 30 seconds later, my voice disagreed with me. You don't know what I'm going to do. Then, without a breath between, yes, I do. You're going to stay for 13 more transmissions. You're going to ask what I am on the 7th. You're going to start crying on the 11th. I'm not someone who cries easily. Years of telling myself to hold it together, to be logical, to be the calm one. Hearing those words, my own tones, my own patterns, lay out my reactions like they'd already happened, made something deep in me twist. I cleared my throat, trying to sound amused and failing. If you can predict me so well, what are you? When the answer came back, it wasn't a repeat. It wasn't even quite my voice. It sounded like someone trying to speak through my vocal cords without fully understanding how they worked. The words rubbed against each other in uncomfortable ways. I am what's left in the spaces you don't listen to, the parts of the signal you ignore. Behind those words, the other sounds got louder. Not static, not interference. Footsteps on dry needles, twigs snapping. A soft, wet exhale like air moving through a throat that hadn't been used in a long time. I turned down the volume, half expecting the noises to fade with the dial. They didn't. They kept pace, just below my hearing, no matter how low I dropped it. I looked around then, really looked. The night seemed unchanged, the same trees, the same truck, the same sky smudged with stars. But somewhere out there, past the reach of my little antenna, some version of me was sitting in a different dark, speaking my words just ahead of me, or behind me, or both. I started testing it with things I hadn't done yet. I'm going to stand up, I said, and stayed seated. I'm going to walk to the back of my truck. My legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. I'm going to pack up and leave before midnight. When the reply came, the delayed version of me sounded tired, almost disappointed. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to walk to the back of my truck. I'm going to pack up and leave before midnight. A pause, then, no, I'm not. I never do when I hear this. That last sentence landed wrong in my chest. When I hear this, not if, not this one time. I didn't remember ever being here before, ever playing call and response with myself on a dead frequency. But the way it said it, calm and resigned, made it sound like I was working my way through a script I'd followed 100 times. Have we done this before? I asked, voice low. Have we done this before? Came the echo. Then softly, yes. You always come back when the sky looks like this. I tipped my head back toward the stars, without meaning to, studying their arrangement. It was nothing unusual, just the long arc of the Milky Way, a smear of light. But I suddenly had the horrible sensation of déjà vu, not from the sky, but from my own body. The way my spine curved in the chair, the exact position of my hand on my knee, the tension in my jaw. It felt like slipping back into a groove worn into reality by repetition. The next question came out of me like someone else had pushed it. What happens if I stay on after 13 transmissions? The answer didn't wait the full 30 seconds. It came early, overlapping my own exhale, like whatever was on the other end had leaned closer. You don't get to hear that version. Something in me snapped then. Fear or survival instinct, or just the stubborn part of my brain that hates being told what it's going to do. I stood up so fast the chair skidded in the dirt. I'm done, I said, thumb hovering over the power button. I'm shutting this off. You won't, my voice replied, right on schedule. You never do, not until you hear... I killed the radio. Silence rushed in harder than before. Not natural silence, not comfortable quiet. This was the kind of absence that makes your ears ache. I realized my heart was pounding loud enough that I could feel it in my throat. Every rational part of me said, pack, go, now. I started moving on autopilot, tossing the chair into the truck bed, ripping the antenna cord free. My hands fumbled with the radio, trying to shove it back into its pouch. As I turned toward the driver's door, the radio in my hand crackled to life. I hadn't turned it back on. My thumb wasn't on any button. But the screen lit up, the speaker hissed, and my voice came through, clear and close, like I was standing just behind my left shoulder. Transmission 13, it said softly. You always make it this far. I didn't remember the earlier ones. I had no sense of how many times I'd spoken into that device, but hearing that number landed like a physical blow. The air felt thick, my vision tunneling slightly, as if my body suddenly realized how close I was to something I shouldn't touch. I'm leaving now, I said, without pressing anything. It felt stupid talking to plastic, but I did it anyway. I'm not saying anything else into you. I'm leaving. The reply didn't wait. I know. This is the part where you leave. This is the part where I stay. There was a softness in my tone I recognize from when I talk to people I know are about to walk into something painful but won't be talked out of it. Drive careful. The turn you always miss is coming up. I slid into the driver's seat, fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. The radio sat on the passenger seat, screen still lit. As the engine turned over, the speaker crackled again. You'll be back, it said calmly. Not yet. Not this version. But another you will hear about the frequency, and you'll think you're the first one to find it. I should have thrown it out the window, left it up there on the rim to talk to itself. Instead, I shifted into gear and pulled back onto the forest road, headlights carving tunnels through the pines. The radio went quiet. The farther I got from the pullout, the more normal the night felt. Bugs, wind, the occasional distant glow of another camper's fire. About 15 minutes down, I almost missed a turn I'd taken a dozen times. The kind of curve you take by feel, muscle memory doing the work. My hands twitched on the wheel just in time. Correcting before I drifted too wide toward a steep drop I hadn't realized was that close to the asphalt. My heart stuttered. I glanced at the radio, at its dark screen. For the briefest moment, as the tires gripped and the truck straightened, the display lit up without sound. The frequency readout shifted on its own, up and down, like someone was scrolling through channels somewhere else with my exact radio. Then it went dark and stayed that way. I've been back to the rim since then, but I don't scan past certain ranges anymore. There are slices of the spectrum I treat like minefields, edges of sound I refuse to cross, because I am not interested in finding out how many times some other version of me has sat in that same patch of dirt, saying the same words into the same device, thinking they were the first one to do it. The worst part is knowing that my voice is still up there somewhere, caught in that loop, waiting for the next curious idiot with a radio and a free night. Maybe you, if you ever go. Maybe you'll hear me before you hear yourself. And when you say, "This is my first time on this frequency," and a half-minute later my voice answers, "No, it isn't," you'll understand why I don't listen to empty channels anymore. They're not empty. They're crowded with all the things we've already said and shouldn't have. If we were sitting together right now, just the two of us, this is the story I'd save for last. Not because it's the loudest or the bloodiest, but because once you hear it, you start looking at every forest the way I do now, as something that remembers you more clearly than you remember yourself. I work for the Forest Service. Trails, maintenance, closures, all the boring stuff that keeps people from walking off a bluff or into an active burn. I'm not a ranger with a shiny badge and a hat. I'm the person they send when something needs to be quietly checked, documented, and, if possible, fixed before anyone notices it was a problem. That's how I ended up on an old decommissioned trail along the Mogollon Rim. On paper, it was simple. Clear the corridor enough to assess whether the path could be reopened as a scenic primitive route. In reality, they wanted someone to go in alone and see why the crews kept putting it off. You can tell a trail has been abandoned long before the official maps admit it. Paint blazes fade, cut logs sprout fungus and moss. The tread, the bare ground, where thousands of feet pack the soil, starts to soften, grass and saplings pushing through. This one had all of that, plus the feeling you get walking into a room where people were arguing a few seconds before you opened the door. The air held something. Not a sound, not a smell, just a pressure. I started from the old trailhead, its sign half swallowed by young pines, and worked my way in with a handsaw and a small spade. Kick rocks off, clear brush, flag anything that needed heavier tools later. It was late season. The rim had that brittle, waiting to snow tension in the air. Each step carried the crunch of frost that hadn't melted in the shadows. The first object I found didn't unsettle me right away. It was a single car key, half buried in the duff right in the center of the old tread. I noticed it because it caught the light in a way brown needles don't. I knelt, brushed it free. Modern make, fob cracked, metal scratched. Somebody dropped it, I thought. Years ago, sure, but that happens. I slid it into my pocket out of habit. Lost and found. The second thing was a child's shoe. That one stopped me. It was off to the side of the trail, heel caught in a tangle of roots. Tiny. Canvas once red, now sun-bleached to a tired pink. No laces. I picked it up, and the tongue came free in my hand, the stitching long since rotted. Something about the weight of it, the way it seemed to hold a shape that wasn't there anymore, made my chest tighten. People lose shoes, too, I told myself. Kids kick them off, forget them at camp, drop them from packs. The forest is a hoarder. It keeps what we leave. I almost turned back then. Not because of the shoe alone, but because of what I felt when I put it in my pack. The forest went. Quiet. Not soundless. The wind still moved, some bird still called, but attentive. Like every tree had paused whatever slow, sap-deep business it was doing to watch me. I kept going. That's who I am, for better or worse. The trail dipped into a shallow draw, crossed a dry drainage, and climbed again toward a ridge that paralleled the rim. As I walked, the pattern emerged. Every few hundred yards, another object, never in a pile, never in obvious view, but close enough to the tread that someone with a purpose, someone like me, would notice. A pair of sunglasses without lenses, arms snapped. A single work glove, leather stiff with age. A crushed metal water bottle with logo worn away. Each time I found something, the air seemed to thicken, as if I were walking deeper into lungs, not forest. I stopped after the fifth item, a weathered wallet with no cash and no ID, just a laminated photo of two people on a boat and a receipt faded to illegibility. I stood in the trail, objects weighing down my pack, and said out loud, because sometimes you do that when you're alone. Okay, I get it. People lose things. The forest answered with a breeze that moved only the branches directly over my head. Everything else, 10 feet out in any direction, stayed absolutely still. That's when the professional part of me kicked in. This wasn't just random litter. Things were spaced too evenly, left too intact. You don't find a wallet, and a shoe, and a key, and a glove, and a bottle along a closed trail without thinking about missing persons. We have files on those. Hikers who never went home, cars abandoned at trailheads. I've read enough to know the summaries by heart. I pulled out my notebook and started logging each find properly. GPS coordinates, description, condition. The forest felt even closer then, like it was reading over my shoulder. A couple of hours in, as the light shifted toward late afternoon, I reached a section where the trail had all but vanished. The trees crowded in, their roots knitting over the old tread. My boots sank a little deeper into the soil, which had that spongy, freshly turned give to it, like something had churned it from below. I nearly stepped on the ring, not jewelry, a ring-shaped arrangement of small objects, half submerged in the dark earth. I crouched, brushed away damp needles, keys, buttons, rusted coins fused together, a cracked phone screen, a small tooth-shaped pendant. They formed a rough circle about 2 feet wide, just off the trail's line, not scattered, placed. I didn't touch that one. Something in my gut whispered no. Instead, I circled it carefully, noting each item, how they faced inward. In the center, barely poking out from the loam, I saw the corner of something flat and white. Paper, maybe. Plastic. I don't know why I did it, but I reached in with my spade and gently loosened the soil until I could grab the edge. It was a photograph, a Polaroid, the kind that develops in your hand. Time and damp had chewed at it, but the image remained shockingly clear. 2 people on a forest trail, packs on, smiling at the camera. Behind them, a signage post. My eye snapped to the background, the shape of the trees, the angle of the light, the faint slash of a blaze on a distant trunk. It was this trail, this exact trail decades earlier. I flipped the photo over, On the back, in smeared ink, was a date from the late 80s and a single word, Rim. No names, no jokes. Just that. People didn't use GPS then. They used memory, paper maps, maybe a compass, and sometimes a camera to prove they'd been somewhere. I put the photo in a dry page of my notebook, hands a little unsteady. My mind was already flipping through half-remembered incident reports trying to match that decade to any open cases. I couldn't be sure yet, but my gut said I would be able to once I got back and pulled the files. The ground shifted under my heel. Not a big movement, just enough that the top layer of soil slid sideways, exposing fresh earth beneath, darker and damp. I stepped back fast, heart leaping. This wasn't a sinkhole or a burrow. It felt purposeful, like someone had nudged the floor under me to get my attention. "Okay," I said again, because talking felt less insane than silence. "You've got mine." It only got worse from there. The trail ended, officially, at what used to be a small overlook, a bulge of land that gave you a clear view down into the tangle of forest below. Now it was partially reclaimed. Saplings had taken root along the edge, lichen crusted over what had once been a low-sitting wall of stacked stone. I knew I'd reached the end not from the tread, which had fully disappeared, but from the way the space opened around me. The trees stepped back, leaving a roughly circular clearing about 10 yards across. The soil here looked wrong. It was too even. No rocks, no fallen branches. Just a flat, dark surface, as if someone had scraped it clean recently. I crouched and pressed my fingers into it. Cool. Damp a few inches down. Not packed like a well-used path. Not loose like undisturbed forest floor. Turned. Worked. At the far side of the clearing, near the suggestion of a view that the young trees now blocked, something metallic caught the light. I walked over. Every step feeling like I was walking on the back of something that might roll over if I disturbed it too much. It was a ring, this time actual jewelry. A simple band, probably once gold, but now dulled. It sat on the surface as if it had been placed there moments ago. When I picked it up, the earth exhaled. I felt it in my knees, in the arch of my feet. A subtle, downward sigh as the soil settled a fraction of an inch. At the same time, tiny sinkings dotted the clearing as other objects emerged from shallow burial. More coins, another key, a rusted watch, a torn strap from a backpack, the corner of a plastic ID card, the cracked casing of a flashlight. The ground was giving them up to me like a hand turning over to show what it was holding. I stood in the center, surrounded by things people had carried into this forest and not taken back out. Each one had the weight of a story attached, and all those stories ended here. Not where they were supposed to. Not back at a car, or at a bar, or around a dinner table. Here, in a circle of soil that remembered all the steps and mistakes and bad decisions that had brought them this far. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. Long enough that the light shifted noticeably. Long enough that my shadow stretched and warped over the ring of objects. Then, near my boot, the earth moved again. Just a little wrinkle at first. A tiny crack appearing in the surface, right at the edge of my shadow. It broadened, flaking away, and something white and square edged upward. My stomach turned cold even before I bent down to see what it was. Because by then I knew the pattern. The forest was curating for me, choosing what to show. It was another Polaroid. This one was newer. The colors crisper. No 80s haircuts or vintage clothing. On the front, the image was off-center, like whoever had taken it had been rushed. It showed this clearing, these trees. The angle was from the trail entrance looking in, and in the middle of the frame, a person stood with their back to the camera, head slightly turned as if distracted by a sound. They were wearing a Forest Service jacket identical to mine. My stomach flipped. I turned it over with numb fingers, dread already rising like bile. On the back, in my handwriting, was today's date. The ink was fresh enough that when I rubbed my thumb over it, it smudged. I had not taken that photo. I hadn't pulled a camera out all day beyond the one on my work phone, and that was still zipped in my chest pocket. I fumbled it out, hands clumsy, and checked my gallery. No pictures, no Polaroids, just the empty grid of a phone camera that hadn't been used. The forest around me held a breath. You know that feeling when everything narrows down to a point, where your body decides for you that the correct response is either to freeze or to move, and you've got half a second to choose which one you're going to live with. That's where I was. I felt like I was standing inside a throat, and the swallow was coming. The rational part of me started listing options. Run. Stay. Document. Pretend this wasn't happening. But under all that, another part, a deeper, older part, whispered something else. It's already written. My eyes went back to the photo. The person in it, me but not, stood in the same spot I stood now, feet apart, shoulders slightly hunched. The tilt of the head suggested they'd just heard something behind them, from the tree line. In the frame, you couldn't see what they were turning toward, just the empty dark between trunks. I became intensely aware of my back, the weight of the pack, the prickle of sweat cooling between my shoulder blades. The sensation, no, the certainty, that if I turned around right then, I would fulfill the image exactly. The thought that hit me next was worse. What if the picture wasn't of now? What if it was of a moment I hadn't reached yet? I did the only thing that felt like it might break whatever trajectory I was on. I stepped sideways instead of turning. One step to the left, boots scuffing the worked soil. The forest did not like that. The ground shifted again, a quick jerk this time, like something had flinched under my feet. Several small objects toppled over, their positions ruined. The air went sharply cold, the kind of cold that hurts your teeth when you breathe in too fast. Behind me, something moved in the trees. Not the wind, not an animal. A single, deliberate footstep, heavy and slow. I didn't look. I couldn't tell you if it was courage or terror that kept my head facing forward, eyes on the trail entrance. My heart hammered so hard my vision pulsed with it. Every hair on my body stood up, waiting for a touch on the back of my neck, for a voice in my ear, for the world to fold. Instead, the forest sighed. The temperature eased up a fraction. The pressure in the clearing loosened, like a hand unclenching. Under my boots. The ground settled for real this time, the way soil does when it's finally done shifting. I took another sideways step, then another, tracing a wide, clumsy arc back toward the trail instead of walking straight like the person in the photo had. I didn't stop moving until I was back among the more ordinary trees, where the tread became honest dirt again and roots snagged my boots. Only then did I allow myself a glance back. From that angle, I could just see the edge of the clearing. It looked empty. No more objects on the surface, no glint of metal, just leaves, shadows. The Polaroid was still in my hand. I nearly dropped it in my haste to jam it into the notebook. I thought about leaving it there, about burying it, or burning it, or tucking it under a rock. Instead, I took it with me. Maybe that was arrogance. Maybe it was the part of me that still believes in evidence, in paper trails and case numbers. Back at the district office, I pulled the missing persons binders, one after another, cross-referencing dates and trails. Half the objects I'd picked up matched descriptions. A key reported lost with a hiker 30 years ago. A pendant noted in a search report. A ring mentioned by a spouse who never got closure. The clearing up on that dead trail wasn't just a random dump of lost and found. It was a ledger, and the forest had started adding names even when we hadn't. I slipped the Polaroid of myself into a separate folder. There was no case number for that. No report. I didn't tell anyone about it, not officially. On paper, my assessment of the trail was simple. Unstable ground conditions. Not recommended for reopening. The line between professional observation and the forest knows how this ends for you and it's already made a note is not one I'm willing to put in writing. Sometimes, though, alone at my kitchen table with the lights off, I take that photo out and look at it. I trace the line of the trees, the set of the shoulders, the way the head is starting to turn towards something just out of frame. I listen to the apartment settle, to traffic far off, to the hum of the refrigerator, and I imagine very clearly what it would sound like to hear a footstep behind me right then, in a place where there is no trail and no rim and no excuse for anything to be standing that close. The forest remembers what happens on its paths. I think up there's a place that remembers what hasn't happened yet too, where every misplaced key and dropped shoe and forgotten ring is a word in a sentence it's been writing for decades. The day I saw my own handwriting on the back of a photo I hadn't taken, I realized something I need you to hear. Sometimes the story isn't you recalling the forest. Sometimes it's the forest recalling you, and it's already decided how the ending goes. The only thing you get to choose is whether you walk straight into the frame or step sideways and hope it has to start over.